The man never asked for a room with a view, which most people did that time of year. He just stood there in a wet parka, snow still clinging to the hood, and slid a folded 100 across the counter. I remember how quiet it got when I reached for the key, not just outside, but inside too. Like the place had gone still to hear him breathe. He didn't offer a name, didn't flinch when the lights flickered from the wind. 2 nights later, the power went out again, but this time only in his room. That's when we noticed the key wasn't where I left it. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and if you've ever worked a night shift that just didn't feel right. And if these stories help keep the quiet company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working the front desk at a small lodge tucked into the Colorado Rockies. I'd only taken the job to get out of Denver after a breakup, figured a season or 2 of mountain air might do me good. The place was remote 35 miles from the nearest gas station, and during winter that road could vanish under snow in a matter of hours. We weren't fancy, but we stayed booked through most of ski season. The regular guests were easy solo travelers, older couples, snowmobilers, sometimes a college group. All of them in one way or another just wanted to be somewhere quiet. Len Turner, the overnight maintenance guy, had been there longer than anyone. Kept mostly to himself, didn't say much unless something needed fixing. He'd start his rounds just after 10 p.m., flashlight in one hand, thermos in the other, humming old songs to himself down the hallway. Most nights were uneventful snowfall outside, fire crackling in the lounge, a crossword behind the front desk. But what happened that February? I've never been able to explain, and I still don't like remembering it alone. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly, because Tuesdays were always the slowest, and we were down to just 5 rooms booked that night. The storm started mid-afternoon, heavy snow, piling up fast enough that most of the guests checked in early. By 8 o'clock, visibility was down to a few feet, and the last reservation hadn't shown. I assumed they'd canceled. But just after 9, I heard the crunch of tires on packed snow. A single car pulled into the lot. Old sedan Colorado plates. The driver didn't rush. He sat in the car for a moment, then stepped out without a coat. Just a parka draped over one arm like he'd forgotten how cold it was. No luggage. He moved like someone who didn't feel the cold, slow, deliberate like the wind didn't bother him. When he came in, the glass door didn't shut all the way behind him. I remember the draft hitting the back of my legs. He stood at the counter and pulled out a $100 bill already folded down the center. Didn't say a word, just placed it between us and waited. I asked if he had a reservation. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly to the side, like he didn't understand the question or didn't care. I told him we had rooms available. Still nothing. So I took the money and handed him a key, room 6, end of the hall, facing the back trail. The whole time, he never took off the parka. Just turned around, walked down the hall, and vanished into the shadows. I watched the key slot blink green. The door click open, and that was it. No questions, no small talk. I've checked in plenty of strange travelers over the years, people running from something, people looking to disappear for a few nights. But this DC was different. He didn't seem like he was running. He seemed like he'd already arrived. Len came by about 20 minutes later, grumbling about a pipe making noise in the laundry room. I told him about the late check-in. He glanced toward the hallway and asked if the guy gave a name. When I said no, he nodded. Like that answered something. That first night, nothing strange happened. Not exactly. The snow kept falling. The lodge settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. But around 1:30 a.m., the breaker for room 6 flipped. Just that one. Len reset it and said the panel didn't look tripped like it had been switched manually. We figured maybe the guest had tried to plug in a space heater or something that overloaded the circuit. I left a note to check on it in the morning. By the next day, the snow had stopped, but the drifts were thigh-high. No one was going anywhere. The quiet man, as I'd started calling him in my head, didn't come out for breakfast, didn't ask for towels, didn't return the key. Len said he saw the lights on in room 6 around midnight, but nothing else. That night, the breaker flipped again. Same time, 1:30 a.m. This time, Len said he could feel something off. Not see, not hear, feel. Said the air in that wing felt wrong, heavy. I didn't laugh because I felt it too. The temperature would dip a few degrees near room 6 like the heat didn't quite reach it, but every vent checked out fine. The morning after the second outage, I decided to knock on the door myself. Just a courtesy check. I figured if he didn't answer, I'd do a wellness call. When I got there, the hallway smelled faintly like old cedar. Not unpleasant, just out of place. I knocked. No response. I waited, knocked again. Still nothing. But the odd part was the door itself. The key slot was lit red. That meant the deadbolt was engaged from inside. Someone was in there. I backed away, gave it a few more hours. No calls came in, no requests. Around 6:00 p.m., Len said he walked past and the light under the door was gone. I checked the system again, no activity on the card reader since the man had entered the first night. No charges, no checkout. I printed a spare key and decided to try once more. But when I opened the drawer where we keep the spares, the key to room 6 wasn't there. I knew I'd put it back. We're required to keys are tracked especially for occupied rooms. I looked under the tray behind the divider, checked every labeled slot. Nothing. The hook was empty. I called Len. He double-checked the room from the outside. Curtains drawn. No noise. But when he tried the handle, it opened right away. No resistance. No lock engaged. The room was empty. Bed made. Towels folded. No sign of use. No tracks in the melting snow on the balcony. No smell of someone having stayed there. The heater was on, but barely. The only thing that stood out was the window, cracked just slightly open, as if someone had left it ajar to let the cold in. We searched the lodge that night. Every wing, every stairwell, every closet. No sign of him. No footprint in the snow. His car was gone too, though neither of us heard it leave. Len doesn't like talking about it, but I know he felt it too, that the man wasn't just passing through. He came for something. Or maybe just to be somewhere the world wouldn't find him. I stayed at the lodge another year after that, but I always double-counted the keys, and I never gave out room 6 again. Not because of policy, because something about that room still feels like it's waiting to be used. I don't usually talk about this, not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, though. Some don't, but because it's one of those nights that sticks with you in a way you don't want it to. I've driven a cab most of my adult life off and on, but for the past 8 years, I've worked full-time night shifts out of Kansas City. The job's mostly uneventful. If you keep to yourself, airport runs, hospital staff finishing late, people too drunk to drive home. I've seen some odd things in that time. Had folks cry in the back seat, had a guy get out mid-ride because he thought I was taking him the long way on purpose. But nothing's ever gotten under my skin the way this did. And if I'm honest, I think part of me knew something was wrong the second he got in. It was winter, not snowing, but cold enough that everything felt brittle. Around 2:30 a.m., I was parked near Main and 33rd Engine idling, drinking burnt gas station coffee that had gone lukewarm. The streets were quiet, just steam curling up from the sewer grates, and the occasional gust rattling old signage on the closed storefronts. A ride request pinged on my dash just 5 minutes away near a partially abandoned strip mall. That part of the city's gone downhill over the years. Half the businesses shuttered, cracked pavement lots with weeds growing up through the concrete. I debated ignoring the call, but work had been slow, and I didn't want to eat into my rent money. When I pulled up, there was just one man standing there. No bags, no phone in his hand, just a stillness to him that caught me off guard. He wasn't pacing, wasn't checking his watch, just standing perfectly still at the edge of the sidewalk, like he'd been waiting a long time. I rolled the passenger window down a few inches and asked if he was the one who'd called. He didn't answer right away, just opened the back door and climbed in, voice low and flat as he muttered, "Yeah, that was me." He looked mid-40s, maybe clean-shaven, coat zipped high. Nothing about him was alarming, but something felt off. I asked where he was headed, and he said, "Just take me north. I'll tell you when to turn." That already put me on edge. Most people give a destination. When they don't, it usually means something's not right, drunk, confused, trying to dodge a fare. But he didn't seem out of it, just quiet, collected, like someone trying to keep something in. I pulled away from the curb and started heading north toward the river. At first, I told myself maybe he just wanted to ride and clear his head. That happens sometimes. Grief makes people strange. But every time I tried to break the silence, asked if he was coming off a shift, if he needed to stop anywhere, he'd either ignore it or answer with a single word. And those answers never led anywhere. We drove like that for 20, maybe 25 minutes. Passed through neighborhoods I knew then, ones I didn't. We were in the industrial district before long warehouses with dark windows, storage yards behind chain-link fences, not a soul in sight. That part of town feels dead after midnight, like even the street lights are tired. I asked him again, "You want me to drop you here?" He didn't say anything, just kept staring out the window. Then softly he said, "I used to come here to think, not anymore." His tone had changed. He wasn't distant now, just heavier, slower. I glanced at the mirror and caught his eyes for the first time. They weren't vacant or drunk. They were focused, sharp even. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me. I slowed the car and eased it toward the curb. There wasn't a building nearby, just a long stretch of chain-link fence and a row of battered shipping containers on the far side. I cleared my throat and asked again, gently, "Is this where you want to stop?" That's when he leaned forward just slightly and said, "You ever think about how easy it is to disappear out here?" The words landed in the air like a rock dropped into still water. My hands tightened around the wheel. I gave a half laugh and said something dumb like, "Yeah, Real quiet out here. But my pulse was already racing. He leaned back, rested his hand on his knee, and started tapping his fingers. Not fast, just a steady, deliberate rhythm that didn't seem tied to anything. The car's engine hummed heat blowing soft through the vents, and for a minute, neither of us said a word. Then he started talking again. Not to me exactly, more like to himself, muttering things under his breath about how some people don't deserve to make it home, how things go quiet before they go bad. I didn't know what to say. I tried shifting the tone, told him I could drop him at a diner or a gas station. He didn't respond right away, just kept tapping those fingers. When he finally did speak, his voice had dropped an octave. "You want me out so bad," he said. I turned in my seat and gave him the calmest voice I could muster. "No, sir. It's just not the safest area this time of night. I can take you anywhere you need." He stared at me for what felt like a full minute. I remember watching the way his jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing on a thought. Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when someone's being kind. It was smaller than that, crooked, like he was enjoying something he hadn't shared with me yet. He said, "You ever pick up someone who didn't want to ride?" I didn't answer. I just shifted the car into drive and began to ease forward, hoping to get us back toward civilization, toward light, toward other people, toward anything that didn't feel like we were about to be buried under something I didn't understand. As I drove, he kept talking. His tone was conversational now, almost pleasant. He told me a story about someone who disrespected him and how he'd taught him a lesson. The way he described it wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, like remembering a recipe. Every detail precise. Every turn of phrase casual. I kept nodding, trying to stay calm, but I could feel my shirt sticking to my back with sweat. When I saw the lights of a 24-hour gas station ahead, I said I needed to stop and get fuel. I don't know if he believed me, but he didn't argue. As I pulled in, I told him I'd be right back and left the engine running. My legs barely worked when I stepped out. I walked into the store like everything was fine, then leaned over the counter and told the clerk there was a man in my car who was scaring the hell out of me. The clerk went still, then he nodded and slid his phone across the counter. As I started to dial, I looked back toward the cab and the back door was wide open. The seat was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I ran out, circled the lot, checked around the building. Nothing. He was gone. Like he'd melted into the dark the second I looked away. Police arrived 10 minutes later. I gave them the GPS route, described the man, even replayed pieces of the conversation. They didn't say much. Took a report, told me to call again if he ever contacted me. One of them asked gently if I'd been under a lot of stress lately, like maybe I'd imagined some of it. But I didn't. I know I didn't. I remember the way his breath felt on my neck when he leaned in, the way his voice changed mid-sentence, the way he spoke about vanishing like he wasn't just thinking about it like he'd done it before. I drove straight home that morning, parked the car, and sat in the dark for an hour with the engine off, just listening. I don't take rides without a destination anymore. I keep the doors locked until someone tells me where they're going. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes when I'm driving near that part of town, I'll check the rear view a little more than usual, just in case. Because whatever that man was looking for that night, I don't think he found it. And part of me worries he's still looking. I don't know if I would have noticed anything at all if I hadn't dropped my charger behind the bed. That's when I saw it, the faintest smudge of a bare footprint in the corner of the floor, right where the carpet met the tile. At first, I thought it was mine maybe from the day I arrived, but the shape was too narrow, too long, and there was sand around the edge. The thing is, I hadn't been to the beach that day. In fact, I hadn't left the cottage since the night before. In 2022, I booked a last-minute stay down in a beach town near Edisto Island. I'd been working remotely as a graphic designer for the past year and was trying to force a creative reset after a tough few months. The listing had good reviews, a tiny one-bedroom carriage house set behind an older woman's home, walking distance to the ocean-quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it looked clean and private, and the price was better than anything else that week. The host's name was Miss Ruth. She was probably in her 70s, soft voice, nice smile, wore a lot of lavender. The first night, she left a little welcome basket outside my door with bottled water, some postcards, and a handwritten note that just said, "Rest well. You're safe here." I thought that was sweet at the time. The cottage itself was small but comfortable. Wood-paneled walls, squeaky screen door, and a low hum from the ceiling fan that filled the place at night. I spent my first day walking the shoreline and sketching picked-up groceries from a gas station a mile up the road and was in bed by 10. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. Not dead quiet, just soft, like the town was trying not to wake something. The second night I stayed in. It had started to rain around sunset, the kind of warm, steady drizzle that made everything outside sound farther away. I worked a little at the table by the window, made pasta, then curled up on the couch with a movie. I locked the front door. I'm always careful about that and slid the deadbolt into place. I remember checking twice because the latch stuck a little. I fell asleep on the couch sometime around midnight. When I woke up a few hours later, the TV had gone dark and the fan had stopped spinning. The whole cottage was silent. I thought the power had gone out, but the nightlight in the bathroom was still glowing. That's when I noticed the door. It was open about 3 inches, just wide enough to see that the porch light had gone out too. I sat up slowly, heart starting to thump. I know for a fact I locked that door. Not just the knob, but the bolt too. I got up, stepped carefully to the entryway, and pushed it closed again. The wood felt cold. I turned the lock, then the bolt, and checked it twice. Everything else looked untouched. No broken windows, no wind. Just that one thing out of place. I told myself maybe the bolt didn't catch. Maybe the humidity made the frame swell. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I was in bed, 10 minutes later, door locked again, phone under my pillow. The next morning I tried to let it go. I made coffee, walked the beach trail, waved to a couple of retirees walking their dog. Nothing felt wrong in the daylight. But when I came back inside to plug in my phone, I dropped the charger behind the bed and saw that footprint. Just one. Pressed faintly into the corner where the light didn't reach. Long, narrow, and still edged with dried sand. I sat there for a long time staring at it. It wasn't mine. I checked my sandals. Nothing matched. And I hadn't been barefoot outside since the first day. The beach was still damp from the storm. That print hadn't come from me. I called Miss Ruth around noon, told her the door had been ajar in the night, and asked if there'd ever been issues with the latch. She sounded surprised but calm, said no one else had keys to the guest unit, told me I was probably just tired from traveling and that she'd have her nephew come check the lock later that day. I thanked her and hung up, but the rest of the day I couldn't focus. I kept checking the corners of the room, listening for creaks in the ceiling that hadn't been there before. That night I left a chair under the door handle, not because I expected anything, just for peace of mind. The wind had picked up and I figured if it moved again, I'd hear the legs drag. I left the kitchen light on too, just enough to keep the shadows from stretching too far. I couldn't sleep. Every time the cottage settled, I sat up and listened. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard a soft creak like a shift in weight. Not wood expanding, not wind. It came from the hallway between the kitchen and the front room. I didn't move at first, just kept breathing shallow, hoping it would stop. Then I heard it again, softer this time, closer, like someone was testing how much noise they could make without waking me. I stayed still, eyes half open, watching the doorway from the bed. Nothing moved. The light from the kitchen was still casting a warm glow, but the hallway was dark. After a minute, I sat up and quietly reached for my phone. I tapped the screen and opened the camera. No sound. I didn't want to turn the flashlight on, just aimed it toward the hall and snapped a photo. It came out blurry, grainy, but there was something in the left side of the frame. Just the edge of a sleeve or a shape. Not fully in the room, just close enough to see that something had moved. I sat there for the next hour, not blinking. Not sure if I'd imagined it or if someone had been watching me the whole time. At sunrise, I packed my things. I told Miss Ruth I wasn't feeling well and needed to check out early. She didn't argue. Just wished me safe travels and said to call if I needed anything. Her tone hadn't changed. Still gentle, still polite, but I noticed she didn't ask what happened. On my way out of town, I stopped at that little gas station where I'd bought groceries earlier in the week. The same older guy was behind the counter, friendly, talkative. I asked if he knew anything about Miss Ruth's rental. He paused a moment, then said his daughter had stayed there a few years back before she moved away. Said it was a nice place, but she left early too. Didn't give a reason. I still have the photo. I've shown it to a couple people, but the blur makes it easy to dismiss. Could have been bad lighting. Could have been a trick of the eye. But I know the door was open. I know there was a footprint in the corner. And I know I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. What unsettled me most wasn't the thought of someone trying to get in. It was the quiet possibility that they already had, that I'd been sleeping in a space that was never fully mine, and that whatever stood in that hallway, it hadn't come from outside. It had come from somewhere I hadn't thought to check. I grew up in a town where the state fair was the only thing anyone really looked forward to. It showed up every September like clockwork. Same faded tents, same dusty rides, same tired music spilling out from cheap speakers above the corn dog stands. By senior year, most of us were over it, but that fall, my 2 best friends, Charlie and Denny, convinced me to go one last time before we graduated. We figured we'd walk around, eat something fried, maybe try to win a prize. Just kill a few hours and take the usual photo booth strip to mark the end of another year. But something about that night didn't sit right. Even now, it's hard to explain what was off, only that once the crowds thinned and the music stopped, The place felt like it had kept one ride open for us, and we were the only ones dumb enough to get on. It was a Friday mid-September. I remember that because the weather had shifted just enough to make the air cool after sundown, but not cold. The three of us got there around 8 and walked the usual loop, funnel cake, livestock barn, that one booth that sold airbrushed t-shirts with wolves or eagles. By 10 o'clock, most of the families had cleared out, and the crowd left behind was mostly teenagers or people who didn't want to go home yet. I think that's why we noticed her. She was working the photo booth tucked between the tilt-a-whirl and the food truck that sold footlongs and lemonade. A girl about our age sitting alone on a stool behind the curtain, flipping through a magazine. She looked bored. Pale face, long braid over one shoulder like she'd been waiting all night for someone to remember she was there. Charlie nudged me and made some dumb comment about how I should go talk to her. I laughed it off, but when she looked up and saw us watching, she smiled. Not big, just a little smirk that felt more like she knew something than anything else. Denny said we should get our picture before they shut it down for the night, and I figured why not. We ducked into the booth, pulled the curtain, and leaned in like we always did. Charlie in the middle, me on one side, Denny on the other. The old camera word lights flashed, and we heard that soft mechanical sound as the strip slid out below the screen. We stepped out and grabbed the photo, but it was blank. Not blank like a misprint, more like overexposed. Just a white strip blurry around the edges like the paper had been fogged before it printed. No faces, no background, just noise. We figured it had jammed or glitched or something, so we turned around to tell the girl. But the stool behind the curtain was empty. No one there. No magazine, no bag, not even a jacket. Just the booth. Lit, running, but silent. We stood there a minute, unsure what to do. Charlie walked around the back to see if she was on break, but there was nowhere to go. The booth was wedged between two trailers. No open space, no exit. We were about to leave when the screen inside the booth flickered again and another strip slid out. Same format, same time stamp. Only this one had a photo. It was us. Except we weren't looking at the camera. We were looking off to the left, all three of us, like something had caught our attention mid-shot. Our faces were blurred, not distorted, just wrong, stretched a little like the image had been pulled too fast, or like we'd moved when we hadn't. Denny laughed nervously and said maybe it was haunted. Charlie shrugged, pocketed the photo, and said it was probably some glitch. But I remember feeling cold, like something behind the curtain had been watching from the wrong side. We left the booth and didn't say much after that. Walked the midway once more, tried to shake it off. But things had changed. The music sounded thinner. The lights flickered more than they should have. And when we passed the mirror maze, I swear the reflections didn't follow us right. At one point, Charlie turned around and asked if I felt like we were being followed. I told him no, but I'd been thinking the same thing. Around 11:45, we started making our way toward the parking lot. We'd parked on the far end of the field, just past the old tractor display. The fairgrounds were almost empty by then, just a few food trucks still packing up, and one ride still running the Ferris wheel, turning slow and empty with no one in line. As we passed the edge of the lot, Denny stopped and pointed toward the chain-link fence near the perimeter. There was someone standing there, still, facing our direction but too far to see clearly. Looked like a girl, maybe the one from the booth. We couldn't be sure. We didn't say anything, just kept walking. When I got home that night, I took the photo out of my pocket again, looked at it under the kitchen light. The more I stared at it, the more it didn't make sense. There were no lights in the background, not from the booth, not from the midway. Just us standing in the dark, our eyes fixed on something that wasn't in frame. 2 days later, Charlie called me. He said he'd gone back to the fairgrounds to see if the booth was still there. It wasn't. There wasn't even a space where it could have fit, just 2 trailers with their backs touching. No curtain, no stool, no power cable. That Monday, we brought the photo to the school resource officer, who told us to take it to local law enforcement if we were concerned. We ended up speaking to a county officer named Delgado. He was polite, but clearly didn't think much of it. Took the strip, asked where we'd gotten it, and said he'd look into it. That was the last we heard. A week after the fair closed, Charlie stopped showing up to class. His mom said he wasn't sleeping, said he was having dreams about things watching him through glass mirrors, windows, rearview mirrors. Always at night, always just outside the edge of the frame. Denny moved away after graduation, didn't tell anyone, just packed up and left. I still have the strip of photos. It's in the drawer with my yearbooks and old report cards. Every time I think about throwing it out, I don't. I tell myself it's just a weird misprint, that we caught a bad camera at the end of a long night. But some nights when I can't sleep, I pull it out and look at it again. And each time I'm more certain that whatever we were looking at, it wasn't the camera. It was something behind it. Or maybe something that stepped in after the flash. Something that wanted to be seen and made sure we weren't. I've never told my parents the full version of what happened. Not because I think they wouldn't believe me, but because I'm not sure I'd believe it if I were them. All I ever said was that something weird was going on out front. I never told them I stopped sleeping near the window. I never told them about the notes. And I definitely never told them about the van. Because even now, when I drive through that neighborhood, I still glance at every driveway twice, just to make sure nothing's waiting. This started when I was 16, still living with my folks in the eastern suburbs of Denver. Quiet neighborhood, the kind where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave at each other from the driveways. Ours was the middle house on a short cul-de-sac, and from my bedroom window upstairs, I could see the whole curve of the street. I liked that room, at least I used to. It faced west, so I got the evening light, and on school nights I'd crack the window just a little to hear the breeze come through. Back then, I used to fall asleep to that sound. It was late September the first time I noticed it. I was sitting at my desk around 11, trying to cram for a history test, when I saw headlights flash across my wall. Not unusual, we had neighbors who got off late shifts, but the lights didn't keep moving. They stopped. I stood up and looked out. A dark gray van had pulled to the curb on the opposite side of the circle, engine still running brake lights on. No logo on the side, no plates I could see. It just sat there for about a minute. Then slowly, like really slowly, it rolled forward, made the bend around the cul-de-sac, and disappeared out of view. I figured someone had taken a wrong turn and thought nothing of it. The next night, it came back. Same van, same time, just past 11. This time, it idled longer. Maybe 3-4 minutes, then crept around the circle and left. By the third night, I was waiting for it. I don't know why. There was nothing outwardly threatening about it, but something in my gut told me it wasn't random. And when it showed up again, same spot, same slow crawl, I watched more carefully. There were two people in the front. Couldn't make out their faces, but the driver had their hands at 10 and 2, rigid and still. The passenger. I swear they were looking straight up at my window. I told my dad the next morning. He brushed it off, said I was probably spooking myself from lack of sleep, or maybe someone was delivering papers or flyers. I didn't push, but that night I stayed up again. This time the van stopped directly in front of our house. It didn't just idle, it parked. Headlights off, engine running low like it had been set deliberately quiet. I crouched behind my desk and peeked out. The passenger door opened, but no one got out. A second later, it closed again. Then the van drove off. I didn't sleep after that. I kept thinking I'd see a shadow cross the backyard or hear a tap on the glass. The next morning, there was a folded note tucked between our mailbox and the flag. No envelope, just a piece of white paper folded twice. It wasn't addressed. When I opened it, there were only 5 words written in thin, blocky letters. We saw you looking out. I showed my mom. She frowned, then said, maybe it was a prank that kids sometimes did weird stuff this time of year. She taped the note to the fridge and forgot about it by lunch, but the van kept coming. By then, I'd stopped sleeping with the window cracked. I'd close the blinds tight shut off the light and lie in bed waiting to hear the hum of tires rolling too slowly. Each night it came a few minutes earlier. 11:17, then 11:11, then 11:05. The night it arrived at exactly 10:59. I knew something was changing. The next night, it didn't drive off. It just sat there, parked at the mouth of the cul-de-sac engine, off no lights. I stayed up until 1:30 a.m., peeking out every 10 minutes. It didn't move. Around 2:00, I finally called the non-emergency police line. The woman who answered took my name and address, said someone would swing by. 20 minutes later, a cruiser rolled into the circle. The van was gone. The officer who came to the door was a guy named Sergeant Williams. Looked mid-40s, kind voice. I remember because he didn't laugh it off. He asked good questions. What color was the van? How many nights, same direction? Every time I gave him the details, even showed him the note. He nodded and said he'd file a report, but unless the van came back, there wasn't much to go on. That was October 3rd. On October 4th, the van didn't show up. Same with the 5th and the 6th. I started sleeping again, slowly. Not great, but better. Until one morning I came downstairs and found my mom holding a white paper in her hand, folded once. Found it tucked under the doormat. Same handwriting. No curtains can hide you. That night, I slept on the floor of my parents' room. Dad said it was probably just a couple of neighborhood kids screwing around, but he still installed a motion sensor on the front porch the next day. The van never came back after that. I sometimes wonder if the light scared them off, or if they got what they needed. I still think about that passenger, the way they looked up unblinking, as if they knew I'd be there. I've replayed those nights in my head more times than I can count, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't watched. Or worse, what would have happened if I'd opened the window. There was no final note. No confrontation, just silence. But sometimes when I drive past old cul-de-sacs or quiet suburban loops, I glance at the curbs. I check the mailboxes. and I swear every so often I'll see the shape of a van at the far end, just sitting, waiting for someone to look back. I booked a lot of strange places during my years of traveling for work, but the one that still lingers with me is a roadside motel in Sonora, California. I had been sent there for a quick turnaround job, one of those assignments where you're expected to drive all day, sleep for just enough hours to stay legal, and then get back on the road again. Normally, I'd pick a chain hotel for the predictability, but that night, every branded place along the highway was sold out. The only vacancy I could find was at a low, cinder block motel sitting in the shadows of the foothills. The place had a lit sign that buzzed faintly, its letters missing in spots, so it just read MOTL. The clerk inside was a heavy-set man named Tony, who looked more like he belonged behind a bar than a front desk. He didn't bother with small talk, just slid a metal key across the counter and told me not to worry about the truck parked out back with its lights on. I hadn't asked, but the way he said it stuck with me. My room was upstairs, number 212, facing the parking lot. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but the sheets looked clean enough, and I was too tired to care. I remember setting my bag down, flipping on the TV, and thinking I'd shower before bed. That's when I heard something, a steady, rhythmic knocking that seemed to echo through the thin walls. At first, I figured it was plumbing. Old pipes can make all sorts of racket. But after a few minutes, I realized it wasn't coming from behind the walls at all. It was from the room next door. The room beside mine, 209, had its curtains drawn tight. Every so often the knocking would stop, replaced by a muffled voice that rose and fell like someone pleading. I told myself it was probably a couple fighting and turned the volume up on the TV. Still, I couldn't shake the way the sound carried a kind of hollow, almost measured rhythm, as though someone was tapping a fist against the headboard or even the wall itself. When I stepped outside for some air, I noticed something odd. Every other room along the row was dark, but a sliver of light bled out from under the door of 209. A woman's silhouette crossed past the curtains, stopping and pausing for long stretches, like she was standing perfectly still in the center of the room. The hairs on my neck stood up without me knowing why. I went back into my room and locked the door. Sometime around midnight, the sound changed. The knocking turned into a kind of dragging thud, like something heavy being shifted slowly across the floor. I stood by the wall, listening, unsure if I should call the front desk. Before I decided, a shadow passed across my window, long and thin, like someone walking the balcony outside. My heart jumped, but when I peeked out, the walkway was empty. I tried to sleep, but kept waking to the sense of movement next door. At 2 a.m, I gave up and went back downstairs. Tony was still at the desk, half asleep, with a small TV glowing behind him. When I asked if he'd rented out 209, his eyes flicked up sharply. "That room's locked up," he said flatly. "Has been for weeks." I must have looked confused because he added, "Sometimes kids try to jimmy the locks. If you heard anything, it was nothing." His voice carried the kind of finality that told me not to press. But when I went back upstairs, the light under 209's door was gone. The silence felt heavier than the noise had. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation does strange things. But when I dragged my bag down to the parking lot, I noticed something that froze me in place. The door to 209 was standing wide open, just a crack. No light inside, no sound. only the faint smell of something stale drifting out. Tony saw me staring and came outside fast, pulling the door shut with more force than necessary. He told me to get moving, that checkout was immediate, and when I tried to ask again about the room, he snapped, "Leave it alone." His voice cracked on the last word like he was more afraid than angry. A week later, after I'd already finished my route, I happened to pass back through Sonora. On a whim, I stopped at a gas station near the motel. The clerk behind the counter was an older guy, chatty in the way some small-town attendants are. When I mentioned where I'd stayed, his face shifted. He asked if they'd really put me upstairs. When I nodded, he shook his head and muttered, "Should have closed that place years ago." I pressed him, and after a pause, he told me the story. A woman had died in room 209 3 summers earlier. No one had found her for almost a week, not until other guests complained about the smell. After that, locals said the room never stayed empty at night. Travelers reported voices, footsteps, sometimes even seeing someone standing inside when the curtains were drawn. Management kept insisting it was superstition, but everyone in town knew better. I didn't say anything else. I just paid for my gas and left. The memory still sticks with me, not because I believe in ghosts, but because of the way Tony reacted that night. He wasn't surprised I heard something. He wasn't skeptical or dismissive. He was scared, like a man who had heard it all before and couldn't bear to hear it again. And what unsettles me most isn't the knocking or the shadows, but the fact that when I think back on it now, I remember one moment too clearly. Just before the light went out in 209, I had glanced through the narrow gap in the curtains. For a split second, I thought I saw a woman standing in the center of the room, her head tilted toward the wall we shared, as though she had been listening to me the entire time. I've only told this story twice in my life. The first time, people laughed it off as paranoia. The second time, someone told me I shouldn't keep talking about it at all. I was 19, then a college student, just trying to save money by renting the cheapest place I could find. It was a tired, red brick apartment building on the edge of town, the kind where the carpet in the halls smelled faintly of damp, and the lights always flickered once before they settled on. I was in Unit 2C, directly above the corner apartment on the ground floor 1A. The man who lived down there was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He never spoke to anyone in the hallway, never took deliveries at the door, never waved when he left. At first, I didn't think much about it. College kids are self-absorbed, and I was no exception. But it didn't take long for me to notice how strange it felt to live above someone who never seemed to sleep. It started with the sounds. Most nights around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd hear muffled thuds from below, as if heavy furniture was being dragged from wall to wall. Other nights, it was a faint, static hum, like a radio stuck between stations. Once, when I pressed my ear to the floorboards, I could swear I heard whispers, faint, overlapping voices, speaking in a tone too low to make out the words. At first, I chalked it up to thin walls and the odd habits of night owls. But one night I was coming back late from the campus lab, and as I unlocked my door, I realized the hallway was completely dark except for a pale glow leaking out from the gap under 1A's door. I paused, thinking maybe he'd left his television on. But then I noticed the shadows, several of them moving across the light, passing back and forth, like there were more than one person inside. That struck me as odd, because I had never once seen anyone visit him. Not a friend, not family, not even delivery drivers. And yet, the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that there were at least 3 figures moving inside that dim, flickering light. A week later, I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of someone coming up the stairs. My door has a small peephole, and when I looked through it, I expected to see a neighbor fumbling with keys. Instead, I saw 2 men I'd never seen before, dressed in dark jackets, standing completely still at the top of the stairs. They didn't knock. They didn't try a door. They just stood there silently as if listening. After a long moment, they turned in perfect unison and went back down. When I crept to my window, I saw them walking toward 1A, disappearing inside without knocking or ringing. By then, I was sleeping badly, half expecting to wake every night to footsteps or low voices through the vents. The one time I worked up the courage to mention it to the landlord, he brushed me off, saying the tenant in 1A had been there for years without complaint. His answer didn't make me feel any better. The breaking point came in late October. It was cold enough that I kept my windows closed tight, but that didn't stop the smell. One night, a foul odor seeped through the vents, sharp and metallic like a mix of rust and rotting meat. I gagged, shoved a towel under the door, and barely slept. The next morning, when I confronted Tony, the building's handyman, he just gave me a weary look and said, "Don't get involved. Trust me on this." That was enough for me. I called the police, not an emergency line, just the non-emergency number. I half hoped they'd tell me it was all normal. Instead, they sent a detective. Officer Lyman was his name. He knocked at 1A's door while I watched from the top of the stairs. The door opened just a crack, but I couldn't see who stood behind it. The exchange was short. A few words I couldn't make out, then the door shut again. When Lyman came back upstairs, he looked irritated. "Nothing we can do without cause," he said. For a few weeks, things calmed down. No footsteps, no shadows, no smells. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the worst of it. Then one night, just after Thanksgiving break, I was woken by the sound of my doorknob turning. Not rattling, not forced, just a slow, deliberate twist, like someone testing it. I froze in bed, staring at the dark outline of the door. After a long moment, the sound stopped. Through the silence, I could hear faint footsteps descending the stairs toward 1A. That was the night I decided to move. I broke my lease and found a couch to sleep on until finals ended. The landlord didn't even seem surprised when I dropped off my keys. He just nodded and slid the envelope across the desk like he'd been expecting it. Months later, after I'd moved into a different building across town, I saw Officer Lyman again by chance. I asked him, maybe foolishly, if they'd ever looked into the man in 1A. His face changed in an instant. He told me quietly that the unit had been vacant for years. No active lease, no tenant on record. I told him I'd seen someone there, that I'd watched people go in and out. He just shook his head and said, "You're not the first to think that." Then he walked away. Sometimes late at night when I wake without reason, I find myself listening for that faint, static hum, as if it could carry across the miles and years. And I wonder whether the man in 1A ever really left or if he was even there to begin with. I had a job that sent me through airports more than I care to remember. Most of the time, those nights blur together late connections, quiet gates, and the dull ache of fluorescent lights humming overhead. But one night in Dallas still feels sharper than the rest, like something I should have left behind in that terminal, but never did. It was December of 2016, a cold night even for Texas, and my connection had been delayed by storms. I wandered past shuttered restaurants and empty moving walkways until I found myself near one of the smaller regional gates. The area was nearly deserted, just one janitor working slowly down the hall, her cart squeaking with every push. Beyond the window, past the glowing tarmac lights, sat an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be there. The plane looked wrong. Not destroyed exactly, but scorched along one side with a jagged tear near the rear fuselage. It reminded me of photographs I'd seen of crash recoveries, yet there it was parked like any other commuter jet. No airline markings, no visible crew, just dark glass and a faint reflection of the sodium floodlights overhead. I should have turned back toward the main concourse, but something about that silent aircraft pulled me closer. The seating area near its gate was empty rows of chairs gleaming in the dim overnight lighting. A monitor above the desk cycled through information, but the text was garbled full of symbols instead of letters, as if the system didn't recognize what flight it was meant to show. When I leaned against the glass to look at the plane again, I saw him. A man sitting perfectly upright in one of the cabin seats, visible through a window just behind the wing. His posture was so still that at first I thought he might have been a mannequin placed there for testing. But his head was turned slightly angled, in a way that suggested he was staring directly back at me. I blinked, expecting him to vanish in the reflection, but he remained. His outline was just clear enough against the dim cabin to make out the shape of a collared shirt and the glint of glasses. No movement, no nod, no gesture, just that frozen stare. I waited long enough for the janitor to pass behind me and wheel her cart down another hall. When I glanced back, the man hadn't shifted an inch. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the service door near the gate desk, half expecting an alarm to sound when I tried the handle. To my surprise, it clicked open easily. A short staircase led down toward the tarmac, and the cold night air rushed in to meet me. I hesitated on the top step, listening for the voice of some guard or worker who might call me back, but the ramp stood deserted. The smell hit me halfway down charred metal, faint but distinct, the way old campfires smell days after the flames are gone. As I reached the base of the stairs, the plane loomed larger, the blackened scars on its fuselage clear under the floodlights. The boarding door stood ajar, tilted slightly, as though it hadn't been opened properly in years. I climbed the mobile ramp until I stood at the threshold. The cabin inside was dark, yet not completely. Emergency strips along the aisle glowed a sickly green, casting long shadows across rows of empty seats. Empty except for the man I had seen through the window. He sat 6 rows in hands, resting on his knees, head turned toward the door as though waiting. I opened my mouth to say something what I'll never know, but before a word escaped, the sound of static filled the cabin. It came from the overhead speakers, soft at first, then growing louder until it was almost unbearable. The man did not move. He did not blink. He simply sat there bathed in the dim green glow, while the static built like pressure in my skull. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping on the ramp, and forced myself out into the cold air again. When I looked back through the window, the seat was empty. There was no one in the cabin, no silhouette in the green light, only vacant rows stretching toward the rear. I hurried back up the stairs into the terminal, heart hammering in a way that made me feel suddenly much older. The janitor was gone, the hall silent except for the hum of the vents. When I turned for one last look through the glass, the plane itself was gone. The tarmac sat empty under the floodlights as though nothing had ever been there at all. I never mentioned it at the gate desk when my real flight finally boarded hours later. I didn't tell my coworkers, and I certainly never asked airport staff about a wrecked plane parked overnight. But sometimes when I'm passing through airports, even now, I find myself checking the windows at quiet gates. Not for flights, not for delays, just for the shape of someone sitting too still in the cabin of a plane that shouldn't exist. That memory has stayed with me the way all the others do. Looking back, I realize that none of these stories were supposed to matter much. An odd shift at work, a drive through the wrong road, a night in a cheap motel. These are the kinds of details that vanish from most people's lives forgotten as soon as the week moves on. And yet for me, for the others who told their pieces, those small moments became something larger, something unsettling enough to last decades. What unsettles me most is how ordinary the settings are. Highways, diners, apartments, airports. We pass through them without thinking, trusting the hours of the night to keep us safe. But the truth is the world feels most fragile in those in-between spaces when the streets are quiet and the only witnesses are shadows and reflections. That is when we notice things that don't belong, or perhaps things that were there all along waiting for someone to see. I don't know what these stories mean when taken together, except that they remind me of how thin the veil of normal life can feel. Whether it's a figure in a window, a stranger who knows too much, or the silence of a building where no one should live, the details blur. But the feeling remains, even years later, as though we brought a piece of those places home with us. Maybe you have too, without realizing it yet. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of tonight's stories. If you'd like to hear more, I invite you to subscribe, share this with someone who listens the way you do, and join me again on another night. And tell me, have you ever passed through an ordinary place that left you with a feeling you could never quite shake?